Hello there. I've spent decades working in national and international media, and it's no secret to those who know me that I have become increasingly disenfranchised with what passes for journalism these days. It's a joke, only we're not laughing. Many people have woken up to the agendaed nature of mainstream media, particularly after the lies of the last 3 years. But so many haven't. And those who remain in the dark often do so because they are lulled into a false sense of security by people they trust in mainstream media. Those faces and voices are there day in and day out, and they provide something of a comfort blanket in this chaotic existence we call life. They are also almost overwhelmingly gatekeepers. Now, first of all, let me explain to you what I mean by gatekeeper. There have been theories about gatekeeping for at least 100 years and studies for probably about 50. It's a known phenomenon which basically runs like this. Every news desk and reporter has an abundance of news stories brought to their attention. Only a limited number of those can be presented to the public. The organization itself has a news criteria through which a sort of prism through which they decide whether that story is suitable for their platform or not. Those who use that criteria become the gatekeepers. They let some stories pass through the gate and they close other stories out of the gate. They control, they limit, and they shape what the public knows about. Now, of course, we know that mainstream media has an absolute agenda because, quite by coincidence, they all seem to choose roughly the same dozen stories each day to focus on. Because you know why? It's a consensus of propaganda. So, having spent 30 years as a journalist, I see gatekeepers everywhere, pretty much like the kid in, what was it? It was a Sixth Sense, where he said, I see them everywhere. And I thought it important to document that, really, because the more famous ones obviously have a huge impact on our lives. They are brainwashers. They reach more people and they garner more attention for their extremely dubious thoughts. So, and here's the thing. I see journalism as about talking truth to power, about exposing injustices, the wrongs in our world, and protecting people. But gatekeepers reinforce and prop up government, often to the detriment of people, just like they did during the C-19 period. So, my first gatekeeper is a British journalist and broadcaster who is well known and whom I worked with for over a decade on his huge BBC Radio 2 show, which has consistently had millions of listeners. He is Jeremy Vine. Just to be clear, I'm going to make a case as to why Jeremy Vine is a gatekeeper for the establishment and the globalist agenda in general. I'm not suggesting he is being paid directly by government or other interested parties. To do that, I would have to have evidence, and I have no evidence of that, and I do not seek to make that claim. There, that's my disclaimer, because I know what a crybaby Jeremy Vine is. Any mention of his name on the internet, he likes to control what is said about him very tightly. He has a notoriously thin skin when it comes to criticism, just as many people do in his position. For example, Philip Schofield. Vine may well push to have this video removed, but I've abided by the rules in compiling this report, and there is no legitimate reason to warrant removal. It's one of the reasons I make extensive notes so that these people can't catch me out, either legally or in any other way. So I do refer to my notes throughout. So first of all, let's look at Vine's public image. I call him media's Mr. Vanilla. It's nothing to do with his skin color, of course, and everything to do with the way that he has been sold to us. Vanilla is one of those bland but apparently inoffensive tastes that sort of mix with most other tastes and do not overpower them. Its influence is silent but still very strong. If Jeremy Vine was a paint colour, he'd be magnolia. Generally tends to fit into most homes, but you get the feeling it's all very staid and conventional, lacking in originality and well past its sell-by date. Jeremy Vine is a very useful man. He comes over as awfully Middle England, respectable, responsible, reasonable, reliable, nice background, private education, scholarship to a prestigious college, a lovely CV for legacy media, where such a background is equated with being a well-rounded individual. But the reality is, Jeremy Vine's thinking is closer to that of a tyrant. He is the perfect media weapon to maintain the establishment status quo. Jeremy Vine is that man who appears harmless on the surface, but his impact is troubling because he aids the prevailing orthodoxies against the people. He's far from one of us. His early days in media, he was always said to be obsessed with media. He set up a school magazine. He had a young DJ slot on Kenny Everett's show on Capital Radio and was interviewed on Danny Baker's television show. Quite a fair bit of big platforming for an unknown, which is curious in itself. He edited the student paper at Durham University and interviewed the infamous Leon Britton in 1986. We put up posters. Leon Britton talks, says Jeremy. In fact, we got nothing out of him, which is a pity, because in 1986, there was really plenty to discuss with Leon Britton. Leon Britton is now dead. But for that same year, Leon Britton, who was a former Home Secretary of the British government, was said to have been photographed in a police investigation entering underage rape parties in North London alongside dead paedophile MP Cyril Smith. Britton was also part of an internet list, which was alleged to be a guest list associated with the Elm Guest House in South London, where children's parties for perverts were held. So yes, Jeremy got to interview this man, and by all accounts, it was a complete wasted opportunity. How convenient for the dubious Leon Britton. Vine's career is a thoroughbred establishment media man. Even though he works for other broadcasters, he is a BBC man. He worked on the controversial BBC programme Newsnight from 1999 to 2002, the same news show that went on to stifle the Jimmy Savile report that outed him as an abuser. Savile, like Vine, is a BBC man through and through. He's their creation. They are a type. I am, of course, not suggesting for a second that Jeremy Vine is a paedophile or an abuser. I'm saying that there is a BBC type and they are crafted in a certain way. Vine has all the qualities of being a member of the Secret Services. The background, the class, the ability to be vanilla and fit in. It's a fact that the BBC has a legacy of appointing either spies or those who have been selected by the Secret Services. The corporation was forced to admit that MI5 selected employees, and they admitted that a couple of years ago, and they said that was a few decades ago. But it's been going on for decades, and no doubt it is still in effect to some degree, because we absolutely know that the BBC is not impartial. It is absolutely at the control and behest of whoever is in government and the attendant agencies around that. Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying Vine is a spy. Remember, he has a notoriously thin skin, and I don't want any legal hassles from that man. But I am saying he is a perfectly compliant tool of the British establishment. Whether he's a shill or not is almost irrelevant, because the impact is still the same. Now, Jeremy is a notorious pusher of the globalist green agenda, and anyone who has had the misfortune of being caught on his bike camera and then blasted all over Twitter can testify to this. He is an avid cyclist and regularly films himself tearing from one high-paid job to another in central London on his bike and amongst London traffic. He has become infamous for capturing situations that outrage his middle-class sensibilities, and he frequently says more. These kind of things, the way that he responds and reacts to people on the street, frequently says more about his own fear, his own paranoia, than it does about London traffic. But he also, it's interesting because he also captures the public's reaction to him. And let's put it this way, more than one passerby has called him a word that rhymes with anchor. And fine, you know, despite the BBC's so-called impartiality, Vine was recently found to have breached that impartiality with his massive support of the green agenda, and in particular the 15-minute cities, also known as low traffic neighborhoods. Now, so let me see, Vine, he completely overstepped the mark here by backing the measures of low traffic neighborhoods and criticizing those who opposed it. near his West London home. One local anti-15-minute city campaigner complained to the BBC and said Vine's repeated tweets in support of the scheme represented a campaign of abuse against a legitimate campaigning group. They claim Vine breached the corporation's impartiality rules by expressing a view on a controversial matter in a manner inappropriate for a, in quotes, journalist who should be non-biased. Oh, excuse me while I laugh. After an investigation, the BBC's editorial complaints unit sided with the member of public and concluded that Vine had indeed breached impartiality rules. Good. But it's just a token slapped hand and nothing to really concern him. But it tells us plenty about him and at least one of the problematic agendas that he supports. So let me tell you a little bit about my first-hand experience with him. I came to work with Jeremy Vine because one of his producers had spotted me and thought I would be a good fit on the show, which aired 5 days a week on the BBC network. It was hard to see what they thought was a good fit about me. Vine, as we all know, appears to be a safe bet. I clearly am not, because I speak my mind and I'm not bored. Vine happily follows official narratives. I made it my business to scrutinize them, from experimental jabs to the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. So I first started working on his show around 2006, 2007. I was actually really liked on the show, particularly by Jeremy and his producer, Andy West. Andy would later become famous in his own right on Big Brother. We went on to be friends up to a point, even going out for food and drinks one evening. But we did have a major separation at one point when it turned out that Andy, after Vine and after Big Brother, had started working with Mermaids, the charity that is involved in transing children. At one stage, I had become a significant feature on Jeremy Vine's show, appearing several times a week. I have run through forests and museums while reporting live on air, and even from the Occupy movement, obviously, which was in London as well as other parts of the world. And astonishingly, I was even given the role of mother during Parent Week. Now, this is an occasional annual event that Jeremy Vine's Radio 2 show had, where they focus on the numerous issues surrounding parenting. And I, with all my unconventional ways, was given the spot of telling that to literally millions of people. It was a fantastic opportunity. I had a blast, and my daughter even appeared on the show talking about being a teenager and what it was like to have me as a mum. Can you imagine that? Live, you've got your child telling the nation what it's like, what your parenting is like. Anyway, I came out of it quite well, thank goodness. And the thing is, the producer said that they polled the staff about who should be mother, and I'd come out with the most votes. And I actually thought that was really big of the team at the time, because as I said, I was far from a safe bet, but they gave me the chance and it was great. So you can see that even though lots of people thought that Jeremy Vine was an anchor, for many years I didn't. I thought he was okay. I didn't agree with his politics when I was on his show, but he gave me fairly free rein to say my piece. Free speech, right? That's what I thought. It's only when you step back, see the bigger picture, and realize that dissenters, rebels like me, are in effect useless idiots who add to the illusion of democracy in legacy media. When there is no such thing, it doesn't exist. Editors choose what to debate and the parameters of it. Free speech in media debates does not happen. It just appears as if it does. So things were okay with Jeremy Vine and I until about 2017, when we had a clash. Now, of course, given the number of debates I had done on the show, we had clashed a few times, but this one was markedly different. It was following the Manchester Arena explosion. I was on the show to discuss it, and I made a comment that marked my card as a problem. It was absolutely tangible to me that I had done that I had trespassed in a way that I should not have done, because I wasn't invited on the show for months after that. And it was noticeable given the frequency of how many times I actually was on there. Have a listen to what went down and see how the cat was set among the pigeons.
We see that's really interesting, because you then take a political line with your child. You might be wrong, Sonia. That might sound like you're justifying it.
Yeah, no, I'm not justified, Jeremy. What I'm doing is I'm looking at every facet
You're
of it.
blaming Tony Blair.
I've encouraged my child to look at every facet of the picture as well. Remember, the enemy is not always obvious. We're immediately told here it's ISIS, but is that really the truth? Is it, for example, a false flag operation, you know, a term that comes from naval warfare, where we're told that it's one entity, but it is in fact another? These things are often political, Jeremy, and it ill behoves us to deny children that knowledge. And a perfect example, because I know people always want examples, is as a consequence of the atrocity on Monday, look at who quickly benefits from that. So Theresa May, who removed 20,000 police as Home Secretary from our streets, is now deploying an army on the streets. It's a totally disproportionate reaction. It is political. It would be quite wrong and irresponsible of me not to inform my daughter of these things as she's growing up, so she can get the full picture, Jeremy. It's important.
And you're going to tell us next that on 9/11 the towers were brought down by the Bush government, are you?
You want me to say that, Jeremy?
I'm just thinking that's where we're going.
No, Jeremy, you want me to say that because it would be really easy then to dismiss me as a conspiracy theorist. But the truth is there's a great deal of data online if people want to search that information. But we have to be careful. The mainstream media sets an agenda, and your reaction just then, it completely plays into that.
So you see, I had stepped out of the box, contemplated other matters rather than the official narrative, and that was a big problem for Vine and his handlers. But it was around 2018 that my relationship with Vine and his show properly went west. Through my work to do with protecting children and the sexualization of them, I had stumbled across transgenderism, and I was a little disturbed, to say the least. I went down that rabbit hole and was shocked to discover that men were insisting on being called women, women were insisting on being called men, lesbians were told that they should sleep with men, lifelong socialists were called bigots, and children were being obscenely brainwashed into believing they were born in the wrong body, and then further down the line put on a pathway which included puberty blockers and surgery to remove actually healthy body parts. Really horrendous stuff. Of course, I hated it all, mostly because I'm not insane and I know what abuse is when I see it. Turned out, however, that Jeremy Vine was on the other side of the crossing. He had cozied up to a number of men who claimed to be women, promoted the idea that we should just call them women because calling them trans women just invited more questions. So up until 2018, I had seen Jeremy Vine as a moderate, but after that, it was clear that he was far from it. Expecting the world to pretend that people can change their sex is not a moderate position, or indeed change their gender. Either way, men cannot become women, women cannot become men. Call yourself what you want, just don't compel me to do it. And that is where the problem comes in. And Jeremy Vine was very much involved with that agenda. Now, so the thing is, one day we had this sort of mother of all clashes on Twitter where he and this social commentator who appears on his show, a guy called Owen Jones, don't even get me started on him, but he'd appeared on his show, and Owen Jones is another, trans women are women guff. And Owen Jones and Jeremy Vine were all like, oh, it's terrible what's happened to women. I think it was actually in the wake of the Sarah Everard murder at the hands of a cop. Hands of Wayne Couzens, and Jeremy Vine and Owen Jones, like, it's really, really terrible. We have to protect women, but none of them know what women are, right? So I made this tweet basically about how obscene it was what they were doing. And Vine took great offense. He tweeted this all hurty-worty at me, and there followed a series of tweets back and forth in which he attempted to deny his support for the transin of people. But I and others came with that brilliant thing called receipts.
And I'll never forget it. And it just fascinated me. And I found it completely startling, this cover of this record. And it stayed with me for life, this feeling of a 7-year-old seeing this picture. The record was Hunky Dory by David Bowie, and it shows Bowie on the front as essentially as a woman. You can't really tell, but it completely threw me because his name was David, and he on the front of that is female. And over the years, I've realized what an incredibly groundbreaking moment that was for him to do that, to show that he can make a choice about his appearance, his gender, sexuality, if you like, and he can be who he wants to be, and he can be inimitable and completely David Bowie. And he could also change constantly.
And we made him eat his words. He couldn't cope with it and he blocked me. Oh dear. And he had once thought so highly of me. Like this tweet, for example, when he was tweeting about one of my reports. So you see, what I had learned about Vine is that he will play the victim when he's under the microscope, but he appears completely ambivalent to the widespread damage he has created by both spreading fear and propping up fascism in this country. So it was during the C19 period when it became clear to many that he was not only not a moderate, but he was a danger to the liberty of people. His support for the narrative and pushing of jabs was above and beyond what could have been asked for by his handlers, and it was absolutely sick. Now, just to outline this, he appears on a number of media shows, primarily his long-standing and popular Radio 2 weekday show, which I appeared on, as I say, regularly, and his less popular, tabloid-esque meatheads as commentators morning debate show on Channel 5 in the UK. In fact, he replaced 2-decade-long host Matthew Wright on the show because it turned out, allegedly, that Matthew Wright was not made of the right stuff, which was actually the name of his show, when it came to the transgender debate. It appeared that Wright was given the heave-ho by bosses after a man who claimed to be a woman was referred to quite rightfully as a man by another guest on the show. According to show business gossip, that was too much for the woke Channel 5 to cope with. Jeremy Vine, who is woke but not awake, turned out to be the perfect compliant man to fill Wright's shoes. Now, don't get me wrong, Matthew Wright is also a compliant journalist in many, many key respects, just not this particular one, it turned out. Jeremy Vine's panels on Channel 5 are full of the most divisive media heads, including race baiters and actual fascists. His show and his guests have promoted mandatory jabs, that the unjabbed should be isolated from society and held down against their will to be jabbed. These are not moderate positions, not at all. But then Vine, as we are seeing, is not moderate. He's not. It's all an illusion, and a very clever one. You know, from what I can see, he has been pushing a number of agendas for a very long time. Most recently, I see that there is a new drive to demonize the sick and disabled people in this country, just as mainstream media and the government worked together to do in 2012. This is nasty, divisive stuff, crapping on the most vulnerable amongst us, but that's his journalistic USP, division. The number of fascists on his show is like a rally, all these people marching around and telling other people about public health, while frequently being obese and unhealthy themselves. Journalist Carol Malone, who I cannot find enough repugnant words grotesque enough to describe her, said, and I quote, "Your rights in a pandemic should be put to one side," when the subject of mandatory jabs was on the Jeremy Vine show. They present fascism as an issue of public responsibility, and that is not moderate. Yeah, have a listen to her. Sick bag at the ready, of course.
Your human rights in a pandemic should take second place to society. You have a societal responsibility.
You do have a societal responsibility.
And here's another totalitarian nutter on the Jeremy Vine show spouting dangerous, illogical, and unscientific rubbish.
I've made the choice to get protected so that I don't infect you, Julia, or your mother, or your father, or my mother, or my father. I wanted to get that jab in my arm as quickly as possible. Let me finish and then come back. I got that jab in my arm as quickly as possible so that I would be less of a risk to society.
You know, here's the thing I know about having spent decades doing media debates. When the debate is framed as a question, I can guarantee you it's really about discussing the official narrative and promoting that. Let's be clear here. The Jeremy Vine show takes Vine away from the BBC creation of Mr. Vanilla and into territories that show us more truly who he is. Here's some of the egregious topics that Vine has covered on his tabloid show. Care home, sack staff who refuse jab. ? Gender neutral toilets. What's the fuss? ? I mean, maybe women being raped. Maybe that's the fuss. Climate change, your top priority? ? Vaccine refusers letting down the country? ? Nicola Bulley, who was a lady sadly now reportedly dead, who went missing recently in the UK. And the Jeremy Vines angle on that was prosecute amateur sleuths, ? Of course, because as you will see shortly, Jeremy Vine very much plays into a narrative that is very dangerous when it comes to internet censorship. So all of these, for example, they've all were presented as questions. These examples should go some way to showing how he is maintaining narratives that are important to the establishment and the status quo. As one example, you would never see me asking if we should be sending fighters to the Ukraine, which is what he did. Instead, I ask, why are we funding America's proxy war in the first place? See the difference? You'd never get that from Vine. His TV handlers would spontaneously combust. His version makes the viewer believe that the war is appropriate, and the only question is whether we could be doing more. Are we doing enough? My question makes the viewer question the validity of the war in the first place. His seals the official narrative. Mine questions it, just as the role of a journalist should do. He's pushed so many agendas, it's hard to keep up, but let's try. Obviously, there was the whole C-19 narrative, the experimental jabs, Agenda 23, the UN's sustainable development. He said he's a trans ally. Then his conviction against YouTuber Alex Belfield has helped him be the perfect helper to force through the online harms bill. If you're not familiar with this, it's the government attempting to push into law serious censorship on the internet, including your use on social media. Now, legacy media hacks like Vine, who make a living from mainstream media and traditional forms of media, do not like social media. They do not like social media users because this gives people too much power. It depletes the ability for people like Vine to just brainwash you on a constant basis. He is fact-checked in real time, and that is a problem for the agenda-led mainstream media. Let me just be clear about something about Alex Belfield. I wasn't a fan of his, not at all. I know he had I know that he displayed troll and stalking behavior, but honestly, Jeremy Vine's over-egged testimony was like something out of a Hollywood movie. Obviously, Alex Belfield was imprisoned last year for, amongst other things, stalking people, including Jeremy Vine. Now, Vine claimed that he was so scared of Alex Belfield that he had a picture of him in his hallway as a warning to his daughters and his family to beware, and in case Belfield showed up. And now there was lots of things I personally found repugnant about Alex Belfield, but it was clear to everyone that he did his stalking on the internet rather than in person. I just want to be really clear here. I do not undermine the impact of internet stalking, having been subjected to it many times myself, but you would expect that. I'm a journalist, I'm a public person like Jeremy Vine. To a certain degree, you are going to have dissenters. That happens, that comes with the territory. Obviously, threats, lies, defamation is a whole other story. But let me just carry on with this, right? It was evident that Belfield wasn't an actual physical stalker, that he used the internet to do that. And for me, it was troubling that a grown man like Vine would seek to frighten his daughters in this way by having an image of a man who is like your demon, your devil, your enemy there in the hallway. That's just peculiar. It's peculiar. And I think it says something really significant about Jeremy Vine's paranoid mindset. He branded Belfield the Jimmy Savile of trolling, which is, as somebody who fights for survivors of child abuse to have a voice, I find that particularly repugnant. Like to compare what Alex Belfield did to what Jimmy Savile did is just obscene. Jimmy Savile was a serial abuser of people both dead and alive. It's just no comparison, but it's just disgusting. Here is Vine talking about his experience with Belfield and the lack of assistance from YouTube and Twitter. Have a listen. I think it's really insightful as to how he's a useful idiot for the online harms bill.
So we went to YouTube and said, come on, you know, what's going on with this guy? You can't allow him to just defame. But the fact that YouTube hosts this stuff, they have no responsibility. They don't care. I am disgusted by their lack of values, and Twitter as well. You know, the guy he's in prison and he's still got a Twitter account.
See what I mean about wanting total control? And that same totalitarian and draconian outlook was what he brought to the C19 narrative for almost 3 long years. Free speech, do me a favour. Vine and Belfield are tailor-made for internet censorship. They could almost be working together. For me, there is no doubt that it was during C19 when most of Vine's critics came to realize what a thoroughly reprehensible individual Jeremy Vine is. His C5 show was vital in spreading C19 fear and misinformation, but then Channel 5, the broadcaster, was up to its neck in receiving money from the government in order to promote the narrative. Now, look, I'm not singling out Channel 5 for that. They were all at it, taking taxpayers' money via the government to effectively be silent about questioning what was really going on. That includes ITV, Talk Radio, and LBC, amongst many other broadcasters and media outlets. Government spent, that we know of, at least 184 million of taxpayers' money, frightening the crap out of us. Well, not me, and not people like me who saw all the way through it, but millions of people were petrified by those government ads, and rightfully so. Remember this one? The thing is, did Vine push that narrative or what? Even in 2022, when he had a few sniffles, he sought to make capital out of it, and he was calling for shielding again, right? Deranged. So he has gone from being Mr. Awfully Middle Class who went to prep school, said nice things, not controversial things, and what he's become is someone who was suggesting some of the most tyrannical measures to be used against our people. It was the classic bait and switch. People brought into him because he appears harmless on the surface, but they discovered he and his output were far from it. Now, let me just be clear again, because remember, Vine thin skin. I'm not saying he's a paid up member of Big Pharma, but I am saying that he still promotes them as if he's on the sales team, just as the other media heads like him do, e.g. Vanessa Feltz, who said, give me 27 jabs. Yes, please do give Vanessa Feltz 27 jabs. Andrew Neil, who wanted us cast out of society. Nick Ferrari felt that he could tell us all about public health, and more and more and more. They are all part of the same racket, including Piers Morgan, who will be the second gatekeeper that I tackle in the near future. They are what I call repeaters, not reporters. That what they do is journalism, not journalism. Now, the funny thing was, and this is quite funny, is it turned out that despite everything, the clashes about gender, etc., the skirmishes, I had not been completely blacklisted from the Jeremy Vine show. And in 2020, a producer contacted me and invited me on to talk about masks. Now, before you get excited, it was not how pointless or problematic they were, although I would have undoubtedly said that, but how people were littering the place with them. I mean, look at the tabloid rubbish of that debate. Of all the things that you could discuss about masks, Jeremy Vine's show wants to talk about how they're a litter hazard. That's how pathetic it is. Talk about lowest common denominator. I actually refused. I refused to go on the show because by that point I had had enough of Vine and his illusion of democracy. I'd finally come to understand exactly the problem with media like Jeremy Vine and how people like me had propped it up, and I gave them credibility. You see, having alternative thinkers contribute to mainstream media debates is all about creating that illusion that I alluded to earlier, that all sides are represented, but it's an absolute lie. The parameters of a media debate have already been set before the first word is uttered in it. Your current social media maverick or maven may be appearing on Jeremy Vine or Piers Morgan and coming away with brilliant sound bites and gotchas that they managed to express during the debate. But what does it really amount to beyond social media props? Nothing. The illusion that change will take place. It never does. Not as a response of a media debate, let me tell you that. Very little, if anything, will change because media agendas are largely already set with the biases of the proprietors and the bribery of advertising and friends and globalist agendas, etc. Political debates are notorious for creating this left-right paradigm, but we all know it's cobblers, because the reality is most MPs, regardless of political affiliation, adhere to the same establishment agenda, including globalism such as WEF and the United Nations. So yes, Jeremy Vine has been very useful to his handlers and the globalist agenda. He is not mired in scandal, other than that nasty business of his 10-year-old daughter being made a director for his Jelly Vine company, and which enabled him to pay less tax. It's all perfectly legal, albeit questionable. She's no longer the director, but it still looks wrong, and we all know it, and we all know why he did it. But that, for the most part, has been his only controversy, which is why he has been so damn useful. Apparently, clean hands has a huge value when it comes to being a trusted propagandist. Now, I want to end this with his support of the proxy war between Russia and Ukraine. Now, this is some truly horrific stuff. Vine was speaking to a caller called Bill from Manchester under a segment I referred to earlier about sending fighters to the Ukraine. He asked Bill, "What's your problem with fighting Russians if they've invaded Ukraine? What's your problem with doing that?" Seemingly referring to the events of World War II, Bill replied, "Russia were our allies. The people of Russia are not our enemies." Jeremy was not happy about that. He cut Bill off mid-sentence saying, "But that's then." The conversation continued a little bit more, and then Vine said, "The brutal reality is that you put on a uniform for Putin and you go and fight his war. You probably deserve to die, don't you?" Unsurprisingly, Bill did not agree with the mercenary Jeremy Vine and responded, "Do you? Do kids deserve to die, aged 18 to 20, called up, conscripted, who don't understand it?" Jeremy added, "That's life. That's the way it goes." And that, ladies and gentlemen, is who Jeremy Vine is. Someone who preaches that we should have societal responsibility for others, that we should take care of others, be kind, be an ally, but someone who is also happy to see other people's children murdered in a proxy war for America. He is, and will never be, my kind of journalist. He is a gatekeeper through and through. And now, were you in any doubt whatsoever, you know it too. Have a great day.